go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the Caribou Ecology and Recovery webinar series, which is co-hosted by ABMI's Caribou Monitoring Unit and the NBCKC with funding support from the Regional Industry Caribou Collaboration. Today is our last webinar of 2021, and we will be hearing from our regular co-host, Melanie Dickie, as she presents some of her recent work. On the screen, you should see some information on the call for abstracts. We are filling up spots for next spring, starting in, I believe, January. And so if you guys can go online to the ABMI's Caribou Monitoring Unit webpage, you'll be able to find the form that you can fill out to register for that. And during the presentation today, I will be monitoring the chat. So if you guys have any tech issues that you need help with, feel free to add your message in there. It'll come straightly to me. And as well, I'll be moderating questions at the end of our presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Melanie Dickie, and take it away, Mel.
Thanks so much, Tatiana, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to be talking about disentangling the influence of anthropogenic habitat alteration from climate on expanding white-tailed deer populations in Western Canada. This project is partly my PhD, so through the UBC Okanagan, as well as a collaboration with the Caribou Monitoring Unit at ABMI. So before I get started, I want to thank my co-authors on this, Rob Soroya, Craig Demars, Marcus Becker, Stan Booten, and Adam Ford. So with that, I'll go ahead and jump in and talk about white-tailed deer invasion into the Western boreal forests. So Latham et al. In 2011, which seems like a while ago now, found or looked at the abundance of deer from the mid to late 90s to the mid to late 2000s and found an increase in the presence of white-tailed deer. This is in the Fort McMurray region of the boreal forest in Alberta. And not only was he interested in looking at the abundance of white-tailed deer, but also what that meant for the occurrence of deer and other prey species in the diet of wolves. So here on the y-axis, we have the percent occurrence within scat, and on the x-axis, we have different prey species. Moose, deer are what I'll be focusing on, but also caribou, beaver, and small prey. And contingent, or at the same time as this increase in deer abundance in the area, Latham found an increase in deer occurrence within the scat of wolves. At the same time, we see this decrease in moose occurrence within wolf scat. So wolves were essentially switching from a moose-dominated diet to a deer-dominated diet, along with some other smaller species like beaver, and a slight increase in caribou. And at the same time period, we see stable populations of moose. So it's not necessarily because moose are declining and deer are increasing, but rather deer populations were increasing with the invasion of this species into the Western boreal, expansion from farther south and further east, and a concurrent change in the diet of wolves. And here I am talking about white-tailed deer invasion and how that influences predator species, mainly wolves here. But why am I talking about that at the Caribou Ecology and Recovery webinar series? Well, with an increase in the abundance of white-tailed deer and the then increase in the abundance of predators like wolves and bears comes an increase in incidental predation on caribou, and this apparent competition between white-tailed deer and caribou. Now, white-tailed deer and caribou might not necessarily be competing per se, but the competition is apparent through the shared predator. And one of the main hypotheses behind this expansion of white-tailed deer populations is human land use or anthropogenic habitat alteration, namely through cutting of the forests and creating lush early cereal vegetation in its place, which represents a forage subsidy for white-tailed deer. If we dive into these effects a little bit in more detail, Laurent et al. 2021 looked at the probability of deer being present, so that's the y-axis here, the vertical axis, versus habitat alteration on the x-axis. And what we see is that sites with higher human habitat alteration in the surrounding vicinity, we get an increase in the probability of deer being present at that site. And that is true for both the winter season as well as the spring season. Now, Fisher and Burton have also done some work to look at this in a few different papers, but here I'm going to focus on fawn occurrence. So Fisher and Burton looked at fawn occurrence using camera traps and found that both natural landscape variation as well as anthropogenic habitat alteration was related to the probability of fawns being observed at sites. And specifically, they found the effect of anthropogenic features was 2 orders of magnitude higher than natural landscape differences. So both of these papers, along with quite a bit of work before them, have really dove into the effects of anthropogenic habitat alteration and built this argument that areas with higher human habitat alteration indeed facilitate the expansion or invasion of white-tailed deer populations. The main mechanism in which we think that's happening is through this creation of early xeroforest. If we look back at the schematic, the one question that really remains to me is the amount of landscape alteration from humans enough to really see that expansion and increase in deer abundance? So far what I've been talking about is the probability of occurrence, which is a metric kind of abundance, but just because you're there doesn't mean you're a higher population. And it's really important to keep in mind that the direct disturbance of these features in the boreal forest, while there's obviously lots of anthropogenic habitat alteration in the boreal, the direct disturbance is less than 10% of the landscape in the areas where these studies are occurring. In the boreal forests, it's up to 20%, but that's largely in the southern part of the boreal forest. So is this increase in deer abundance really tied to habitat alteration, or are we mostly seeing a change in the distribution or occurrence of the species? And the main other thing that's changing in this region is, of course, climate. And anyone in the region has seen it themselves. I'm sure it's been a crazy winter already, but how does climate affect white-tailed deer populations? Here on the y-axis, we have the probability of deer being present, again, which is something very consistent with what I've shown you so far. But now on the x-axis, we have the mean winter severity. So essentially, as we move from the left to the right of this figure, we get harsher, more severe winters. And we see a decline in the probability of deer being present at a site based on increased winter severity. And there's a point at which the winter severity at a site just becomes too much for deer to be present at that site. And we can map this winter severity across the landscape, as well as the line where we expect to see deer being present from that previous figure. And if we look over time, we've seen that this line of deer being present has increased or moved northward over time. So on the left, we have the 60s, and on the right, we have the 90s. And you can see that that red line has moved from the Manning, Fort McMurray kind of region up north to the high level region. And that stops just in the 90s. Laurent et al. 2021 also kept in mind this influence of climate, here measuring climate using actually weather, snow depth. So again, on the y-axis, we have probability of deer being present at a site. On the x-axis, we have snow depth. And we see that as we move from left to right and sites have deeper and deeper snow, we get a decline in the probability of deer being present at that site in winter. But also interestingly, there's a lag effect where here we're seeing spring occurrence or spring probability of presence being at a site relative to the mean snow depth from the previous winter. So not only does snow influence whether a deer is observed at that site during the winter, but also in the following spring. Now, Fisher et al. 2020 also took a look at how the probability of deer being present or occupying a site changes over time throughout the year. So here, I want you to focus on the black line, not the red. They're kind of the inverse of each other. So the probability of deer occupying a site as we move throughout the year at any given site. So really what's varying here is the time of year, i.e. strongly weather, right, with winter. And what we see is that every winter, the probability of deer being at a site declined quite a bit. So we see those populations getting knocked back, but then they recover each spring and summer, which is a little bit different from what I just showed you with Laurent et al., who showed that lag effect, whereas here we don't see that lag effect as much, deer really coming back in the following summer. But one thing to keep in mind with all of these studies is the effect of human habitat alteration and climate are largely confounded. So what I'm showing here on the left is human habitat alteration in Alberta, and on the right we have temperature, just a metric of climate to keep it simple. And we see that as we move north throughout the province, we get a decline in the amount of human habitat alteration, and we also get harsher climates. So here in temperature, we get colder average temperatures, more severe winters. So there's this confound between human habitat alteration and temperature, which makes these things really hard to decouple. So the goal of my work is to really focus in on disentangling the effect of habitat alteration, human habitat alteration, and climate on white-tailed deer densities to understand what's driving or facilitating this expansion of white-tailed deer over space and time, which will of course have large implications for how we manage deer. That's important for how we manage caribou, as I've kind of set up in the introduction, but it's also really important for things like chronic wasting disease, which we're seeing move through the deer populations and is actually, in fact, really butting up against caribou range now. But it also has implications for understanding the abundance and distribution of species more generally in quickly changing landscapes, which is one of the most difficult things to do right now as an applied ecologist, because we have both climate and human impacts on the globe changing across space and time so fast and in such a confounded way that it's often difficult to disentangle these effects. And I'm doing this by leveraging a natural contrast. I call it natural, but it's human. A contrast in the amount of human habitat alteration in Alberta versus Saskatchewan, right next door. So everything I've talked about so far has really been focused in on Alberta, where there is some variation in human habitat alteration, of course, but by and large, we don't get to stretch out that axis of human habitat alteration very well in Alberta without butting up against that confound of climate. By expanding over into Saskatchewan, where human habitat alteration is 3.6 times lower on average, we can start to really look at that effect of human habitat alteration, keeping climate relatively stable. So here on this figure, what I'm showing you is caribou ranges in green and the amount of disturbance within those caribou ranges as defined by Environment Canada and Climate. Environment Canada, let's just go there. Sorry, my brain just stopped working. In gray shading, and you can see that the gray shading really drops off across the border. And in each of these black rectangles, we have camera traps to monitor mammal populations and really contrast that low human habitat alteration to the high human habitat alteration. If we look in at these grids that are 4 kilometers by 12.5 kilometers, we have 25 wildlife cameras placed randomly within these grids. These grids or clusters are chosen to account for land cover and fire broadly to make sure that we're getting good representation relative to the caribou range. For example, not all of our grids are in recent burns in one area and in no burned areas in another area. And then we can estimate the density of deer at each of these cameras and scale that up to calculate the average density of deer at each of these clusters or grids using the time in front of camera approach. I won't get into too much detail about how we estimate deer density from cameras, but I'll give you a quick overview just so you understand what I'm talking about here. So we have this kind of example landscape, my white slide with camera traps on it, and we have critters moving about the landscape living their lives. Some of this time they spend in front of camera traps, and other camera traps don't observe the species of interest at all. And we can use this information to estimate density. So first, we can add up all of the amount of time that animals were in front of the camera while it was operating, taking into account how many individuals were in there. We don't need to know individual per se, but if there's 2 deer, we need to make sure that we're accounting for that when we're adding up the total amount of time animals were in front of the camera. And then we divide that by the total area sampled by the camera, as well as the total time sampled by the camera. Now, because we have seconds on both the top and bottom of this kind of formula, we can scratch those out, they cancel each other out, and we're left with the number of animals per unit area. Now, the first step I wanted to take here was to evaluate the relative support for variables that are generally hypothesized to drive deer densities. So this is a little bit of a, okay, what do we know exercise. So the first one is human habitat alteration, as I've been talking about so far. I used a measure of both direct human habitat alteration, sorry, I also use the term disturbance interchangeably, as well as buffered disturbance. So I'll just give you a look at what that looks like. Here on the y-axis, we have the density of deer, the number of animals per unit area, and on the x-axis, we have human habitat alteration. The different shapes of these points are just the different years in which we monitored. So we've had the camera traps out from 2017 to 2020, and we're about to go out and collect the last year of data for this question. On the left, we have just straight up direct human habitat alteration or direct disturbance, measured using ABMI's human footprint inventory and Saskatchewan's new human footprint inventory as well. On the right-hand side, we have the buffered human habitat alteration, which was collected using ECCC's habitat alteration layer, which is consistent across the entire area and buffered by 500 meters on either side. If you're familiar with the federal recovery strategy for caribou, that's the data that was used here. And I looked at direct disturbance because it's a little bit more mechanistic for that effect of early sterile vegetation. But I also looked at buffered human habitat alteration in case there are any kind of zones of influence or edge effects going on. And in both of these figures, you can see that generally at the high habitat alteration, there's an increase in deer densities, but it really isn't until we get up high that we start to see that. For climate, I used a multifactorial analysis to combine a variety of climate metrics. Using remote sensing data, essentially I combined summer precipitation and summer temperature, both maximum and minimum, which kind of tells us a little bit about summer growing conditions and forage, as well as winter precipitation, winter temperature, both max and min, the length of the snow season, the average snow water equivalent, and the cumulative snow water equivalent, all of which kind of wrap up to tell us something about winter severity. So I put all of these variables into a multifactorial analysis, same as like a principal components analysis, and it broke down into two axes. The one on the bottom, which explained the majority of the variation between sites, 54%. Axis 2 or axis Y was about 20%. And they can be interpreted essentially as long, cold, snowy winters. As we go from negative values to higher values, we get longer, colder, snowier winters. Axis 2 on the y-axis can be interpreted as going from dry, warm summers up to wet, cooler summers. So it's kind of like the ecological interpretation of these two axes. And here I just plotted out I color-coded the points based on the amount of buffered disturbance. You saw before that buffered and direct are pretty similar. Here I've got buffered. And you can see that above this 0 line on climate axis 2, we have a lot of high anthropogenic disturbance sites, and below it, we get a lot of low anthropogenic sites. So that's really showing that confound that I was talking about before, which seems a little bit problematic. But if we focus in on the axis 1, on the left-hand side of the line versus the right-hand side of the line, we don't see that big difference in disturbance, and instead there's a nice gradient in disturbance as well as climate, and they're not super confounded. I also wanted to include information on habitat context. So instead of looking at things like land cover, I wanted to really dive into habitat productivity and distance to agriculture or the prairies. And the reason for that is because sites with higher habitat productivity or more forage availability should have higher deer densities. And we also know that agricultural zones can provide a forage subsidy to white-tailed deer as well. So just looking at what those variables look like, because I like to be transparent and really show what the data looks like as I go through these. Here on the y-axis, we have density again. On the x-axis, now we have habitat productivity measured using delta EVI, which essentially is an enhanced vegetation index, and the difference going from a leaf off season to a leaf on season. The higher the value, the larger flush in deciduous vegetation that we're measuring, so higher habitat productivity. And we see that deer increases as we have higher habitat productivity. Now on this new panel on the right here, we have distance to agriculture, and we see that when sites are close to agricultural zones, they have a higher deer density, and it declines as we move farther and farther away from the agricultural zone. So I used a model selection approach to evaluate the support for each of these variables. We don't have a ton of data, so I can't go ahead and, well, we have lots of data, but we don't have lots of individual sites. So we have to be careful about throwing too many variables in a model. So here I'm just taking a quick look at what the main drivers of deer densities look to be. And looking at this, we can see that delta EVI, or that measure of habitat productivity, has by far the lowest AIC in this table, which tells us that delta EVI is a pretty good predictor, or the best of the candidates at least, for deer densities. Couple notes before I move on, that direct human habitat alteration kind of outcompeted the buffered alteration by nearly 20 AIC units. So moving forward, I'm discounting that buffered human habitat alteration and working directly with direct human habitat alteration. And also Climate Axis 1 on its own beat out Climate Axis 1 and 2 combined. So moving forward, I'll also focus on Climate Axis 1, which is that longer, colder, snowier winters. So now with that information in hand, I really want to evaluate the relative effects of climate and habitat alteration, accounting for productivity. So now knowing that delta EVI or habitat productivity is a strong predictor of deer densities, I really want to try and tease apart those effects of climate and human habitat alteration. So here again with model candidates, you'll notice that all of these models now have delta EVI in them to account for that effect of habitat productivity. And we're comparing models that have direct human habitat alteration versus climate versus the interaction of direct habitat alteration and EVI versus climate and EVI. So I wanted to look at the additive versus interactive effects of delta EVI, knowing that the effect of climate, for example, might depend on how much habitat alteration there is on the, or how much habitat productivity there is on the landscape. So for example, deer may be able to withstand harsher winters if they've got lots of food available to them. And if we look at the AIC, we see the strongest support for the additive effect of Climate Axis 1. So it beats out the additive effect of direct habitat alteration by quite a bit, but we are fairly close to be transparent for the interactive effect of direct human habitat alteration. So we want to keep in mind that effect of direct human habitat alteration, but the effect of climate does kind of win out in this model selection process. So then looking at what that model looks like, I'll dive into it a little bit better or more for you here. On the y-axis, we have the density of deer. On the x-axis, we have the climate axis 1. And in the different color coding on these points, we have delta EVI. So on the x-axis, that's a long, cold, snowier winter as we move to the right. And the lighter colors are higher habitat productivity. And we see that line of predicted density as a function of climate really follows the data, aside from these outliers, which you may have noticed before. And now that we've color coded it by the metric of habitat productivity, we can see that this outlier is also the site with the highest habitat productivity. So everyone kind of fits along that predicted line, except this one site that has higher density of deer based on the prediction from climate, probably because it has higher habitat productivity. If we kind of flip the x-axis in the color to interpret the predicted density based on habitat productivity on the x-axis now, and climate as the color, we see that the predicted line fits the observed data pretty good, with these kind of low outliers being the sites that really have that long, cold, snowy winters. So they have lower densities than predicted based on habitat productivity, and that is really being driven by those long, cold, snowy winters. Okay, so what does all of this mean and why should we care? What are the management implications? Given the applied focus of this webinar series, I really wanted to dive into what that means for management. Caribou management is largely broken down into kind of 4 different groups of approaches. We can do habitat restoration and protection. We can manage that primary primary prey base so that we can then reduce the density of predators and decrease the incidental predation on caribou. Or we can directly manage the predators themselves, drive those predator numbers down. Or we can do demographic augmentation, things like maternity pens and predator exposures. And if human habitat alteration, in the context of the deer story that I've been talking about, is the primary driver of deer expansion, then we have a pretty good reason to think that doing habitat restoration and continuing or increasing habitat protection would do a good job of being able to kind of stabilize that increase in prey base, i.e. the increase in white-tailed deer densities. But if the effect is largely being driven by climate, we need to do all three. So that's kind of where this work is pointing. We're not saying that human habitat alteration doesn't have an effect on deer densities, but climate is kind of that overarching thing that we need to keep in mind and not forget about, and it's driving deer densities, it seems, more strongly than human habitat alteration. And if we're going to deal with that properly, when managing for caribou populations, we're going to have to realize that restoring all of the human habitat alteration out there might not be enough to decrease deer densities, and we'll have to employ other strategies like prey management and predator management to get those populations back down. And it also means that caribou ranges farther south, where we get less severe winters, we really need to keep in mind that climate effect on deer abundance in mind as we're working on caribou recovery. So with that, I want to acknowledge all of the funders that have really helped with this project. It's been a huge project so far, and it continues on, as well as a whole lot of people involved. Natasha Crossland has been amazing with getting all the field coordination done. Greg Brook from ABMI has been amazing at helping us with cameras. Jack Curry, Sean Concolix, and Bailey McCulloch have been really great as kind of lead head technicians to really help coordinate field seasons. And many, many amazing field technicians have now been involved in this work. So with that, I will wrap up and hopefully let us all go early, given it's the last webinar of the series. But if I don't get to your question, please shoot me an email, and you can also go to the cmu.abmi.ca website for more information about our projects, but also about this webinar series. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Melanie, for a great presentation. We're going to open it up for questions. So if you guys can add your questions to the chat, I will moderate them for us. We have a couple questions already, Mel, so I'll go ahead and ask those, and I'll pair them together here. The question is Delta EBI confounded by alteration and climate? And do you have charts for EBI against alteration?
Absolutely, great question. So Delta EBI is influenced by a whole bunch of different factors: human habitat alteration, land cover, precipitation, all of it. So it's kind of the main mechanistic thing that we really want to get at, but there's a lot of variation in Delta EBI that is not explained by any one of these given things. We had a paper, Trophic Consequences of Terrestrial Eutrophication, that really dove into that, work with Clayton Lamb and Rob Soroya and a big group of folks that really dove into what influences Delta EBI. And whoever asked that question is spot on. It's influenced by a whole bunch of these things that I've been talking about, but there still is lots of variation that we can play with and really dive into those relationships.
Thanks so much. And I believe you've answered the next question already, so I'll go ahead and move down to another. The question is, can you walk through again why the change in habitat productivity doesn't mainly point to land use disturbance?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of wrapped up in the answer to the previous one, but I'll give a little bit more information. We have found, and I mean, it's not news really, that human habitat alteration can move the needle on habitat productivity, but it's not the only thing that changes habitat productivity. There's a huge gradient out there in the kind of natural habitat productivity that's driven by things like land cover, climate, a whole bunch of different stuff. Human habitat alteration does influence it, but it's a relatively small effect. We move the needle, we do affect habitat productivity, but there's lots of other big factors out there on top of that.
Thanks so much. The next question we've got here is, while there is a general winter warming trend, is there also evidence of more extreme snowfall events that could serve to periodically set back deer populations?
That's also a great question. Yes, I mean, we know with climate change, there's a lot of these kind of crazy weather events, and extreme weather events. Those are really hard to monitor because you have to be monitoring them at the right time. And as they get more frequent, we're going to start to see more cumulative effects of them. We're not able to monitor that here with the 2017 to soon 2021 data. That would need to be a longer term program, of course, but I definitely agree that it's something we need to keep in mind. These are kind of ongoing changes in both climate and human habitat alteration, and both of these things are changing so quickly, and then we get these pulses of extreme weather events that kind of mess up our understanding of the average effects based on those kind of quote unquote outliers of extreme events.
Awesome, thanks so much. The next question we have here is, in a given forest type, do fire and habitat alteration, for example, logging, have similar effects on EBI?
Good question. Depends on the landscape or the land cover type. So I don't have a super great answer to that other than kind of it depends, which is not very satisfying, but is all too common in ecology. I will say that I think that there's a lot of room for exploring the differences in how both human habitat alteration of different varieties like forestry differ from natural disturbances like fire or even pest outbreaks in how they change habitat productivity. And with the expansion of remote sensing data, not only back in time with things like Landsat, but also with the increased frequency that we're seeing with some of the newer satellites, will really give us the tools to dive into some of those things. So I look forward to seeing a better answer to that question, hopefully in the near future.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to see. I think there might be some automated stuff from ag work that might be easily transferred over.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, we have another question here. It says, is there a signal that vegetative regrowth following disturbance is also influenced by climate variation and possibly by deer density?
Another good one where long-term data with remote sensing and field-based observation would be really great to dive into that question. I don't have a ton of information to give you now on that, and I think the twist of browse intensity or how the abundance of deer in those areas might influence and feed back into the system is a really great question that I haven't put enough time into thinking about to answer well.
No problem. I'm actually very interested that a lot of the questions coming in here relate to things that might be discovered through habitat monitoring, which is something that one of the members of a group that we're both part of mentions often. He's on the call today, so you might hear that shout out. We have one more question here, and it is, do you have an idea of how well the results will translate to mountain caribou herds who deal with very different conditions?
Awesome question and a tough one. These systems are going to be so different based on those underlying habitat productivity kind of gradients that are tied up in all of these other things. So for example, if you go to a system in the mountains, let's say Revelstoke with interior rainforest, it's going to be so much more productive than a drier system. And you'll really, that increase in forage is going to be so much more, but also forestry is going to be the dominant human habitat alteration in those landscapes rather than in boreal systems that are much less productive and linear features are a more predominant kind of disturbance, at least spatially. So definitely not at all translatable, at least in idea and concepts, yes, but the relationships are going to be so different. So we actually do have a project in the Revelstoke kind of Columbia's region where we're looking at cause-specific mortality of white-tailed deer, which have also really expanded into that part of the system. And interestingly, just total anecdote here, I think it was last winter or maybe the winter before now, I can't remember, we had a whole lot of winter snowfall and we figured, okay, all of these deer are gonna die and they won't make it through the winter. But then all of the snow melted really fast in the spring and we didn't have a single mortality. So despite the really harsh winter, the next spring was pretty easy. And well, we're kind of scratching our heads a little bit. And these things are really difficult to monitor and figure out over time. I don't know if that really answered the question other than to say absolutely the relative effects of these things are going to be very different across space.
For sure. I don't see any other questions here. There are several comments in the questions box just saying thanks so much for a great talk, Mel. And if I don't see any additional questions coming in, I think we'll probably wrap it up. And I just wanted to say a special thank you to all of our presenters this year that have made 2021 a great year full of really interesting webinars and all the time and effort dedicated to putting those together. And I'd also like to say thanks to our audience for attending these bi-weekly and also for submitting excellent questions and being part of that discussion with our presenters. And so with that, I wish you guys all a safe and wonderful holiday season, and we look forward to seeing you back in 2022. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.